All right, notes 3.2 on collecting and analyzing data. So now that we know how to choose an unbiased sample, we now need to go out and actually collect that data. So sampling techniques, let's just do a reminder of some of the sampling techniques that we talked about. We talked about a simple random sample. We talked about a convenience sample. This is from our list from the previous page. We talked about a cluster sample. We talked about a systematic sample. We talked about a stratified random sample. And then we also talked about a voluntary response sample. Okay, so now we need to talk about data sources. Where does data come from? So there are two different types of data sources, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with this from any of your history classes. There's primary sources and there are secondary sources. So a primary source is someone who collects data for their own use. So they're not looking it up, they're not getting the information from somewhere else, they're actually collecting the data themselves, okay? And then a secondary source is data that is collected by someone else. So an example would be Statistics Canada, okay? And they're using a database of information. Okay? All right, so now it's really important to know how to make good survey questions, okay? So just like an unrepresentative sample, the wording of questions can also introduce bias into a survey. A survey should be as free from bias as possible. So the way you word your questions can totally influence the way that people will respond, okay? So there are 5 different types of bias that you guys need to know about. The first type of bias is a loaded question, and you might have heard that before, somebody saying, well, that's a loaded question, how am I supposed to respond to that, right? So a loaded question contains wording or info that will influence a response. And we'll do a couple examples of these in a minute. Okay, a leading question is, and you might have heard that as well, somebody might have told you, well, that's a leading question. A leading question is when suggested answers are provided. As opposed to like an open question, okay? This, even though it's a bias, can sometimes make tallying easier. And some people might just use it because it makes their lives easier regardless of whether or not it will have a bias on their results, okay? A sampling bias is when people you survey have something in common, which may make one response seem more popular, even if it's not. Okay. Response bias is when people deliberately give the wrong answer or they just blatantly lie. Okay, and then a non-response bias is When people do not complete the survey. Or they'll do some of the survey, but they'll leave some questions blank. Okay, so let's see, do these questions have bias? So the first question right here is, you don't like skinny jeans, do you? So the type of bias right here is, we would say that it's a loaded question. It contains wording or info to influence a response. The way somebody might respond to this, if somebody says, you don't like skinny jeans, do you? You're probably going to respond in a way where you're going to say, no, I don't, because of the way that it's asked. It's a loaded question. So right here, the type of bias here is a loaded question. The source is still primary, and it's primary because a person is actually asking someone else some information as opposed to gathering the information from a database. Okay, so now a revised question, a better question to ask so there isn't as much bias in it, is just plain and simply, do you like skinny jeans? Now the sampling technique can be really can be chosen from these 6 samples right here. Most likely it'll be a convenience sample because you're just going to survey whoever you find to ask, right? So this would be a convenience sample. Okay, so question number 2, or example number 2, it says, what do you think of the new driving law? 0.5% alcohol or less? So the type of bias that we have here is most likely going to be a response bias, because people may not necessarily be very honest with you when you give them these choices right here. Okay? That's one option. The answers here vary. You can say that there are more than one type of bias, but it's definitely a primary source because you are collecting the information. Again, you're not getting it from a database. The revised question that you could ask is, what do you think the blood alcohol content should be for driving? Okay. And then the sampling technique, it's again another option to have a convenience sample, or you could have a random, simple random sample where you just randomly choose certain people, okay? Or you could have a voluntary response sample where people will only respond if they want to, and that helps to deal with the fact that that helps kind of maybe to deal with response bias, okay? All right, so that's it for this lesson. Make sure you work on problem set 3.2, and then I will check you off for it and give you some feedback so that way you can get 100% on it. All right, guys, I'll talk to you later. Bye.